Vampires are interesting. The direction of the deck has evolved as new support has come out over the years, having gone through synchro variants and rank 5 spam versions before the advent of links, and no vampire deck has ever really touched the meta. With the new support that came out earlier this year, the deck now has an entirely new direction in board control, stealing monsters, and life point manipulation. Having said that, the deck is still not that good. It's playable for sure, but the deck relies on outside support to push for large damage, and if you build the deck around the new directions, it's back row or bust. While the new support does boost the older versions of the deck in Synchro and Xyz variants, for the purposes of this video, we'll be focusing on a deck that revolves around the new support styles. And to do that, let's cover some of the basics as we go over how the deck works, what its strengths and weaknesses are, as well as discussing tech choices and different aspects of deck building that have gone in to making the deck that it ended up becoming. Finally, at the end of the video, we'll cover some replays showing how the deck reacts and plays against different decks before finishing up with a deck profile for those who want it. And in order to acquaint us with the new playstyles, let's begin with Vampire Red Baron, one of the new support cards. At level 6, you can pay 1000 life points to switch control of one of your opponent's monsters with one of your vampires, and at the end of the battle phase, if it destroyed any monsters in battle, you can summon them to your field. This is an interesting one. The life point payment is fine given the ways the new support can get you those life points back, and quite often, switching one of your lower level vampires onto your opponent's field to then destroy is not only a good way to deal some big damage, but it means you can also steal one of your opponent's boss monsters. And if you go on to destroy one of those lower level vamps in battle, summoning them back at the end of the battle phase can trigger their effects. Therefore, I run one of these, as you can search it when you need it. Speaking of those two, Vampire Retainer and Vampire Familiar both have similar effects. If special summoned, you can pay 500 life points, and in doing so, Familiar will add a vampire monster from deck to hand besides itself, and Retainer will add any vampire spell or trap. They also share a special summoning effect, where you can send any vampire card from the hand or field to the grave in order to special summon them from the graveyard, although you can only use each of their effects once per turn. These two cards are the bread and butter of the playstyle that the new support has brought. Familiar allows for a large range of vampires to be played due to their searchability, and the spell and trap lineup that Retainer can search ranges from a near catch or negation in Vampire Domination to a play extender and support card in both Vampire's Domain and Vampire Awake. I run 2 of each, as 3 is kind of overkill, and given the milling options present from being zombie monsters, there's really no reason to run any more than 2 of each of these cards. Jumping back to the higher level vamps, Scarlet Scourge is another new piece of support that serves a very similar function to Baron, but instead acts as a play extender. If summoned, you can pay a stack to summon a vampire except itself from the grave, although it can't attack this turn, and any monster it destroys in battle can be summoned to your field at the end of the battle phase. The summon effect can not only trigger the lower level vampires, but it can also trigger the draw effect of their archetypal link monster. Outside of that, the battle effect as established is quite useful, and the summon effect synergizes perfectly with the rest of the new support. Due to the searchability of the card, I run 2, as it can be a dead draw in some occasions, so it's usually better to search it via Familiar. Now, you're probably thinking that the battle effects of Scourge and Baron are not that good given their attack values. Fortunately, Vampire Fraulein is a thing. It can summon itself in defense mode when any monster declares an attack, although this is a hard once per turn, and then once per battle with an opponent's monster you can pay life points in multiples of 100 up to 3000 in order to have your monster get a boost by the same amount to their stats. It also has the same end of battle phase summon effect, but you'll almost never use this one with Fraulein. And yes, that damage calculation effect is not once per turn, which is something your opponent often won't realise, so use that to your advantage. The payment is also heavily mitigated by Domain, which I'll cover later, and by boosting Baron and Scourge over 5000 attack, this card is how you will get over bosses and go for OTKs, something the deck can't do without outside support. I run 3, as while it is searchable, you want this card in hand as often as possible, so run 3. You then have the standard zombie support that enables the Retainer and Familiar combos while also putting monsters on board in order to facilitate extra deck plays. Mizuki should be an obvious one, as I run 3 since it's goddamn Mizuki, and what more could you want from zombie support? 2 Shiranui Solitaire are also present solely to get Unizombie out of the deck, and speaking of Unizombie, it's also run at 3. Not only can the Uni-Zombie Solitaire combo enable a bunch of extra deck options, but you can use it to dump the lower level vampires in order to facilitate their effects and the playstyle as a whole. So yeah, 3 Mizuki, 2 Solitaire, and 3 Uni-Zombie is definitely something I recommend running, as it gives the deck a consistency and power boost that it desperately needs. And then, along with 3 Ash Blossom as is tradition in decks that need all the help they can get in slowing the opponent down, the last main deck monster already that I play is Vampire Sorcerer. While it's not new support by any means, the 2 effects it has synergize quite well with the new playstyles. If sent to the grave by an opponent's card in any way, shape or form, it lets you add any vampire monster, spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Additionally, you can banish it to allow you to normal summon any vampire that turn without tributing. When coupled with Domain, this can mean that you can summon both Baron and Scourge without needing a tribute, which does wonders for keeping field presence in a deck that can struggle with it at times. Being a searcher for basically the entire deck also aids immensely with the deck's consistency, even though it is a slow effect. But given this build is focused on board control and card advantage, there isn't really much of an issue here. I run 3, as there really isn't many times where this isn't useful to some extent. So yeah, run 3. And since vampires are pretty straightforward, that brings us already to the spell and trap lineup of the deck. While there is definitely a lot of different cards that can be utilised here, the ones I've settled on are used to help facilitate the control aspects of the deck. And so, we start with Allure of Darkness. Since most of the deck is dark, this is a bit of a no-brainer in my opinion, as you very rarely won't have the resources available to use it. Since it aids in digging for the archetypal back row, I run 2, as 3 can be a bit much in my experience, but this one is definitely up to you. You'll then also be wanting to run 1 copy of 1-for-1 to get out and trigger Familiar while also setting up the graveyard, and also 1 copy of Foolish Burial for the same reason. Monster Reborn is a 3rd card that you'll want to run at 1, as summoning back the lower level vamps are a good way of facilitating a comeback. World Legacy Succession is something that I've been trialling in and out of the deck and am currently running. It's essentially more copies of Monster Reborn, but is also restricted by the once per turn effect and the fact that the monster has to be summoned to a space a link monster points to. Not only can this give you free material for link climbing, but it can also trigger the effects of the lower level vamps as well as Vampire Sucker. I've been running it at 2 just because it brings my revival spells up to 3 in total, but it's definitely one that needs to be played around with as it can be a pretty heavy brick as well. Along with 2 Twin Twisters, since hello this is a zombie deck, discards are just more advantage for you. Vampire's Domain is the first one of the new wave of spell and trap support for the archetype itself. It gives you an additional normal summon at the cost of 500 life points once per turn even if it leaves the field, and most importantly, if you inflict battle damage with a vampire, you gain the same amount of life points. This is pretty much the definition of solid support for the deck. Vampires can make a lot of use of the double normal summon due to Baron and Scourge being a thing, and the life point gain is essentially what makes the deck run due to all the life point payment that's spread across their support. Having said all of that, I only run 2, as you don't want to really run into it by drawing, rather wanting to search it out for your retainer. So yeah, run 2. And now we move on to the 2 traps of the deck, both of which is their new support, and the first of these traps is Vampire Awake. Perhaps one of the most on-the-nose card names in the game, this trap summons a vamp from the deck once per turn, but it's destroyed during the end phase. Yep, that's the whole effect. No banishing from the grave effect, no reset effect, simple as shit up in here. While this card is slow for this day and age, so is the deck as a whole, so sadly it fits right in. Having said all of that, the effect is actually really good for this deck. Summoning Fraulein can save your bacon in the battle phase, and summoning the lower level ones triggers their effects, then sends them to the grave in the end phase so their revival effects can be triggered the next turn. It can also summon Scourge to revive another vampire, giving you 2 bodies on board along with a search that is a great way to get back into the game on your second turn. Like the previous few cards, I run 2 as it's searchable by retainer and it's not always something you want to see. However, pushing it to 3 shouldn't be too much of an issue, as the advantage it gains you can be very good when pushing for the win. The last card in the main deck is of course Vampire Domination, one of the best archetypal negates in the game. When a monster effect or back row is activated while controlling a vampire, you can negate and destroy it, then if it was a monster, you gain life points equal to that monster's original attack, although this can only be activated once a turn. It should be pretty clear why you run 3 of these in the deck. Negating basically everything is stupid good and can stop opponents in their tracks, and the life point gain means you can push harder with your monster effects in order to press the advantage this card already gave you. Being searchable only makes this card even better, so run 3, as it along with Ash Blossom can make it very easy to stall the opponent out and push for game. And that's it for the main deck. Having said all of that, vampires actually have a ton of versatility in their playstyles, and that's something I will discuss and cover shortly in the tech options. For now though, let's move on to the extra deck, and while this version of zombies doesn't delve into it too much beyond undead waifu bait, it's still something that offers a lot of different outs and plays for the deck. Starting with some synchro since Unizombies a tuner, Bilzy is a favourite of mine and I use it a lot for turn 1 plays due to its immunities. Conversely, Shogun Saga is a very good turn 2 option, often coming out of 43 or 4500 attack to help run over high attack monsters and then push for game. Its on destruction effect also allows you to reset the lower level vamps and use their graveyard effects again, aiding in the grind game of the deck. Cyframe Lord Omega can be used to steal resources from your opponent and get a decent body on board, and Black Rose Dragon is barely ever used, but it works great as a panic button for the deck that's good at getting their field back. Coral Dragon is good for removal since this deck isn't impacted badly at all by discards, plus the draw upon being sent to the grave and the fact that it can be used for the aforementioned synchros means it's a good play at any time during the duel. And while some vampire decks revolve around Exceeders, this one only runs 2, Utopia Beyond and Dampier Vampire Sheridan. One I use rarely to push for an OTK, and Vampire Sheridan synergizes well with the rest of the deck, as removal and revival is really good even though having to detach for each effect is a bit of a high cost, something to bear in mind when running him. Moving on to the links of the deck, Borrelload is a classic out to a lot of different boards. Borrel's Sword is the answer to the lack of OTK ability that this deck has, and Saryuja, while honestly rarely used in my testing, is a good way to dig for the cards you need and to trigger the lower level vampire effects. Decode Talker is also a good way to get around targeting effects, and the potential high attack also has its uses. Link Karibo is also useful as a turn 1 option to stall the opponent's attack, and Apprentice Witchling can be useful to push to an OTK or to help recycle your monsters. And finally, the last link monster is of course Vampire Sucker. While its first effect to tribute opponent's monsters doesn't come up much outside of the rare times where I use the second effect to summon an opponent's monster from the graveyard, its final effect is absolutely the best one out of the 3. While it is a hard once per turn, getting a draw for summoning a zombie from either grave is really good, and can often be the difference between extending your plays and setting domination, or ending on a very subpar board. I run 2, as given the grindier nature of the deck, summoning a second one does come up surprisingly often. And that's it for the deck. While it's probably not the best build, I've tried with this one to have it focused on the playstyle of the newer support. However, there are a ton of different cards that can be used to help facilitate these plays or even modify the deck slightly to go into some more extra deck shenanigans. And so, let's cover some of the tech choices of the deck. Vampire Vamp is a good way to go for OTKs, or even just for some monster removal, especially when it can be revived and summoned easily with the new support. Vampire Grace is also a very good way to get some rank 6 fodder on the field, and Shadow Vampire can be used for rank 5s or links, even though it does restrict your attacking ability for the turn. The Duke can be a good way to trigger the effects of all the new vampire support, although the effect can only be triggered on normal summon and that does limit its use somewhat. Gozuki can be used to further facilitate the plays the deck can make, but there isn't a huge amount of space for the effects that can be filled out by better cards. Worth considering though. Armageddon Knight and Mathematician can be used to dump a lower level vamp and start your plays with the latter, also potentially giving you a draw. And Glow Up Bulb can be good for synchro plays, and this deck loves milling effects. In terms of some extra deck techs, Shiranui Sun Saga can be a decent way to pop some cards late game, and the protection effect is also pretty decent, but limited by being on a level 10 synchro of all things. Terrace is a good way to provide some removal even though it's limited by the battle phase, and Ardrias also providing the same options, although without the effect immunity and the battle phase reduction is pretty nice. Volcasaurus is also a very good option for pushing for an OTK despite its direct attack restriction, and the new Doom Chimera Dragon can be a very powerful monster wipe if you can get enough resources to boost up its stats. Dragulus can also be a good way to interrupt the opponent's plays, and the recovery and effect to send any card on the field to the grave is very good and synergizes well with the deck's long game. Vampire Bram can also be of use due to the opponent's summon effect, but the lack of attacking ability you have after that limits its use immensely. And moving on to the potential spells and trap text that you could run in the deck. Book of Life can trigger special summon effects while also getting rid of some of the opponent's materials. Soul Charge is always going to be the ultimate comeback card, but the life point loss in this deck can be deadly. And Burial from a Different Dimension can be good for regaining resources and aiding the grind game. The field spell in Vampire Kingdom is an interesting one. Giving zombies 500 extra attack during damage calc, if a card is sent from your opponent's deck to the graveyard, you can destroy any card on the field while also sending a Dark Vamp to the graveyard. This one is worth considering given the plethora of mill decks and options today, especially since it pops a card and sets up your lower level vamps while doing so. Vampire's Desire can also be used to set up your lower level vamps and give level manipulation for synchro plays, and it can provide another revival option for the cost of sending any monster you control to the grave. I did initially run this in the deck at 2, and you'll see this in the replays, but I found it rarely useful whenever I had it in hand, aside from some very specific situations. Still, it does have some viability and should be considered. Vampire Takeover can also be used to get out the field spell and provide some decent recovery and searching, and while the Solemn Brigade is another way to interrupt the opponent, since life points are a commodity for vampires, it's something that would have to be tinkered with. And finally, Swallow Slash can also be a good way to get the lower level vamps off the field and into the grave for the next turn, while also popping cards in the middle of your opponent's plays. I tinkered with it a little bit, but it would require some testing. And that's it. If there's anything you believe I've missed or would like to suggest, feel free to comment below and create a discussion around it all. But now, let's move on to the final section of the video, the replays, where we showcase how the deck works and reacts in different situations against different decks. So as always, take it away, me. Thank you, me. We are going to get right into the replays, guys. There are 6 this time. Yes, that's right. We got 6 replays, and we're going to jump straight into the first one. So, one of the things about vampires is that they are quite slow. I would have mentioned that throughout the video. As you can see here, we're basically going through and doing a standard turn 1 combo, so to speak. Get your Vampire Sucker out, get one of your Broods out, Vampire Territory, get them out, search them out, sorry, and then we can summon out Scarlet Scourge, or Scourge, however you say it, getting back the Sorcerer. So here we got a bit of an L shape here, so not only do we have an Awakening to summon a monster to the field, usually Fraulein in this situation, we also have a Domination to stop a monster effect, spell trap card, etc, etc, and should Sorcerer be destroyed in any way, shape or form, we also get a Search. This is a very solid turn 1 field of vampires. Interestingly enough, we find ourselves against Psyframes, but the first one here, so as you would, negate the field spell. Unfortunately, here's the second one, which is neither here nor there. At this point, we know from the searching and what that he probably doesn't have anything to stop monster effects, which he doesn't. So we're just going to go through. We get a second Scarlet Scourge because that way we can summon back Brood, get another search off of him, so another Domination to hand. Fortunately, we draw into the Fraulein, which is very, very nice indeed. But unfortunately here, he gets the Black Rose Dragon. One of the things about vampires is they do have a little bit of recovery, especially with Monster Reborn in hand. Traditionally, you know, we would have a couple of cards in hand to come back from that, but that's neither here nor there. In this case though, getting wiped isn't too big of a deal since we already had access to Vampire Awake, etc, etc. So we put on all this damage on board. We go into our second sucker, and this is what I was saying earlier about running the 2. It's for these sort of occasions. And here as well, you're beginning to see in this second main phase how we're able to just get back a lot of resources. So we get a Fraulein back, we get Domination back, so we got a Negation, we got our Battle Trap, got a Twin Twisters set as well. And yeah, as soon as we play that, he tries to activate Delta, Vampire Domination says no, that's why we searched it, and we're just able to attack for game. So that's one of the ways in which vampires are able to sort of come back from, you know, a major setback like being Black Rose. It's not the quickest thing in the world. There are some decks that do it far better, but that's sort of how vampires are able to approach it. So here again, going first, Just some standard shenanigans. Allure of Darkness, which is good. Scarlet Scourge we got 2 of, so we don't need to worry about that. I'm pronouncing that wrong, I know. And again, we set the Desire as just a way to sort of bait out anything like that. The Sucker on board, we didn't get the draw we wanted, but the Sorcerer can do what he wants. Red Dragon Archery destroys stuff, but we get a Search, so we get out the Domination, because we're already set up here in our first hand. Unfortunately, he sets the Judgment, which sucks. But here, Monster Reborn, so good. Search, Summon. Again, World Legacy Inheritor, just another Monster Reborn for the deck, which is so crucial given all the graveyard summon effects, or special summon effects I should say. Vampire Territory, and here's that combo I would have mentioned earlier. So, Vampire's Domain, couple that with Vampire Sorcerer banishing itself, means you can summon out either a Baron or a Scourge here for the cost of nothing, so no tribute, and that just makes it so much easier to maintain field presence. So here we summon the Fraulein so we can get over a Red Dragon. We have to take it all the way down to 100 life points though. And here I make a mistake. Should have used Red Dragon Archfiend to win the game. But that's alright. So we use the Domination on the Vion. He gets a Solemn Judgment off. That's neither here nor there. But that's sort of how the deck works. The only reason I include this replay is just because he's able to completely wipe my board, which I just found really funny. So yeah, but that's the sort of thing deck's capable of. So you see there, went to a full field turn 2, could have won the game easily, even despite all of that. So let's jump over to the third replay. And here it's a bit of a slower one. Again, running Desire at the moment. It was something I took out of the deck towards the end, but like I said earlier, it is worth considering running. I was running it at 2, but here again, so standard sort of setup, a Sucker because it got us that draw, a Sorcerer to get us the Search when it's destroyed, and a Domination to get some life points back and still the opponent. Now, Summoning Recycler, the only reason I know this is Crystron's is because I've played it before. I hoped he didn't have the Self-Nifnir in hand, but he did. So now we're just going to let them do their thing. So here we go, gets the token out. So he's pretty set up, really. But drawing the Familiar was very nice for us. Wyncrer coming summoning out is also very handy. And here, yeah, we're able to search out the Red Baron, which is really easy. Go into the Bottled Swords. Again, the Sorcerer Domain combo gets our Red Baron. Super simple. And the opponent just scoops it up when that happens. Because like I said, Bottled Sword Dragon is basically your OTK enabler. In this case, you know, it would have been really easy just to push for game. But against some other decks, it's very much needed. But here is a bit of a different one. We are going to be playing against very much a meta deck in Trickstars. And as you're probably thinking, how do vampires play against Trickstars? Because the whole point of Trickstars is to burn you to death, and vampires are basically doing that to themselves. So you can see the thing is, now I know I'm against Trickstars, so that's why I've set these 3, because the less cards we have in hand, the less that can be banished, etc. And it means I won't take as much damage. So that's something to bear in mind playing Trickstars as well. So he gets out the double Lycaris. Fortunately it wasn't triple, otherwise it would have been in terrible trouble. We had a present card anyway. But we did get the Mizuki in the graveyard, which is very useful. Banishes a bunch of cards again, so we're just burning through our life points here. But funnily enough, he actually lets us draw into some very nice ones. And so at this point, where it's very much, you've got to calculate how many life points you can afford to lose. So here we go, into the Sucker, Monster Reborn again to bring back the Fraulein, which is fantastic. Having the Domain on board means we're going to get back these life points anyway. Not all of them, obviously, but you know. So here we got a Domination set, Twin Twisters set, 1-for-1 Lure of Darkness is whatever. Yeah, you can see here, Summons Candida, Vampire Domination, just so important in this deck. Just does everything this deck needs. And then yeah, Twin Twisters, just popping those 2, getting them out the way, and at this point it's pretty much GG. You know, you just have to make sure you don't burn yourself to death in the process of getting there. So yeah, summoning that out, getting the etc. Getting to the Bottled Sword, so important again. Domain, so we can, and the Sorcerer combo, so we can summon out the Scourge without any tributes. And yeah, that basically sums up Vampires. Get your backer out of the deck, summon Bottled Sword and Scarlet Scourge, and go for game. Alright, so let's move on to the 5th replay here. This is against a new deck, so Danger Worlds. Unfortunately, yeah, a bit of a shit hand to start with, but an Ash Blossom is never bad. So he's just going to go through, start recycling some stuff, going through all that good stuff. Summoning that Crystal Needle Fiber, which of course we're going to Ash Blossom, because we don't want those plays to continue on. Fortunately, he doesn't get off what's the name? Bigfoot, and so he's left with just these two. We're able to defend ourselves somewhat with Brood, or Retainer, sorry. And then we search out the Vampire's Domain solely because we're preparing for next turn, because we know we're fine for this turn. The reason we search out Domains is because we have Familiar in hand, so we know we're going to be okay. So, you know, Brood, search out Domination, activate Territory, and here's something interesting I would have pointed out earlier. This effect for the normal summon lasts even if this card leaves the field, so it's actually perfect bait for Familiar. So now we've got the extra normal summon sitting there, which fortunately we draw into the Mizuki to normal summons. That's our one normal summon. It's got out a Bottle Sword. We're able to get out the Fraulein, summon out the Scourge, and then from here, very simple. You know, Scourge can attack over either of those. Fraulein can be switched to defensive Bottle Sword, and Bottle Sword can just attack twice and go from there. Basically be GG. And so let's move on to the last replay here, guys, which is against a Dark Magician / Sky Striker engine. Sky Magicians? I don't know. I don't know what you would call it. And here we got a decent hand. It's the first time seeing Solitaire actually in these replays. You do use Solitaire quite a bit, don't get me wrong. It's just kind of funny this is the first time. So he's just over here doing some Dark Magician shenanigans. Just confidence, a good way to summon it, and now he's protected those from battle, which is very nice. But here we go, into your standard shenanigans. So we discard the Retain to get in the grave, discard Familiar to get in grave. We've already got 2 Dominations in hand, which is fantastic. But doing this combo means that we can get a draw, get a search, you know, continue on and on and on as vampires do. Funnily enough, we draw into the 3rd Domination. We're able to summon out these 2, which is very useful when you combo with Fraulein. Unfortunately, yeah, I did forget. Don't get me wrong, I did forget about the battle protection that Phoenix offers. But from here, it's pretty simple. You know, we can just negate. Basically, the next 3 turns, we're able to get 1 negate each, which is really good. We're not too worried about Eternal Soul at this point because he doesn't have Dark Magic Circle. If he did, then obviously we'd be focusing more on that. But for now, it's not that much of an issue. So here he goes for a second Sayuja. I'm not sure why he chooses to go for that particularly, but here he's just doing some deck thinning, which is fine. You know, he gets to his Widow Anchor, but we've got the Dominations there. You know, what can you do, really? What can you do? So we're just going to, of course, negate that. Just having a once per turn Omni negate is fantastic, you know. A lot of decks would kill for a searchable version of that. But here it's just really simple, you know, it's pushing the game. If we had Domain on board, it would make it so much better, you know, have so much more life points. But here, yeah, he's going to do that. I'm going to push that, get the Dark Magician out, search and all that sort of jazz. But at this point, he's just going to scoop it up. Because we have a pretty good field, as you can see. You know, there's no real way, if you have a look at Illusion Magic Eternal Soul, we had that in the bag. But yeah, so that's sort of how vampires work. It's very much sort of a recursion focused deck. Very much focused on grinding out and beating the opponent in the card game advantage scenario. Like you can see here, you know, he's got moved through 23 of his cards, whereas we've got a full field and he's got nothing to show for all his efforts, you know? So it's just stuff like that, and just a slow burn. The Bottle Sword's really good for pushing for the OTK if you need to go for it, which I did a lot. But yeah, so that'll bring the replays to an end, guys. I shall now hand you back to myself, and we shall wrap this video up. And that'll bring this video to an end, guys. I do hope you enjoyed. Here's a deck profile for those who want it. If you did enjoy the video, guys, please remember to leave a like down the bottom. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be keeping up with these once a month. Having said that, I am starting back at uni probably the day before this one goes live. So I'll try and keep up the once a month thing. There'll also be some new content hopefully coming to the channel. I've been working on it for a little while now. It's just a matter of getting like the visuals right and all that sort of jazz. But yeah, you should expect another one of these videos as is tradition at the end of next month. So until then, guys, this has been The Sage as always, signing out.